Have you ever worn a distressed pair of jeans or a tie-dye t-shirt? Have you ever wondered how those designs were created? What is surface design? It is all around you, everywhere you look. It does not matter what it is, a blanket, a towel, a top, a skirt, dress, socks, whatever. Someone had to create the color or design the pattern on it. Someone had to stitch the embroidery. Someone had to dye the fabric. In this lesson, we will explore some decorative techniques used on textiles to make them out of this world amazing. Hi designers, I hope you are feeling good and eager to learn a bit more about textiles. Let's jump into it with our lesson quote. When a garment triggers all of your senses, then it is a full experience. Today's objectives are to define the term textile surface design and explore different surface design techniques like dyeing techniques, how to source for different types of dyeing materials, different sewing techniques, and embellishment techniques. Welcome to lesson 3, designers. This one is titled Getting Crafty because it is all about being creative and experimenting with textiles to really make it your own. Before we start looking at all of the amazing things you can do to make your piece of fabric look more interesting, let's first figure out what exactly the term textile surface design means. Right, so what is surface design? Surface design is any technique used to manipulate and change the surface of a textile to give it a unique and special appearance. These surface design techniques can produce interesting appearances, textures, dimensions, and a wide variety of results. Some techniques are as simple as painting on a piece of fabric, and some are a little more complicated, but we will take a look at some techniques ranging in difficulty a little bit later on in the lesson. But first, let's look at how manipulating textiles can enhance your designs. Do you guys remember in the first module we explored the 2 different types of designers when it comes to sourcing textiles? The one designer will design and source the fabric that will match their design, and the other designer will source the fabric first and design using the fabric and print as inspiration. Now, both those designers can incorporate textile surface techniques onto their textiles and into their design, but manipulating textiles is particularly handy when you can't find what you want commercially, because this way you can create your own piece of fabric that is totally unique. You also have control over the whole process. This really is such a personal journey, which results in very personal and very creative designs. But surface design is not only for new designs, it is also a great way to bring an older piece back to life. Let me tell you a little bit more about that. Like I've said, textile surface design is not only for the creation of new designs, but it can be a great way to bring an older piece back to life. Whether it is a piece that is worn or damaged or is just considered to be out of fashion, considering mending or manipulating it in some way, shape or form to promote longevity and fight disposability is great. It sounds a little bit boring, but the process of giving your clothing a new life is actually quite fun and such a creative process. Jonathan Chapman once said that by mending clothing, you can actually create a deeper and more sustainable bond between you and your material belongings. So a new emotional link or bond between you, the wearer, and the garment. This also gives you the opportunity to create something really expressing exactly who you are, like this jacket in the image. On top of it being more sustainable and you being able to create something that is 100% you and that screams your personality, this is also quite a big trend, mixing something old with something new. A while ago we spoke about the trickle down and trickle up effect. You, as a designer, have the opportunity to create something that will trickle up to fashion designers and big retailers, becoming a source of inspiration. How amazing is that? Like I said, the clever and creative use of your fabric can result in beautiful and interesting designs, giving your design dimension, and it is a great way to really draw the attention of the viewer. Manipulating techniques can really take your design, old or new, to the next level. Before we look at how to enhance your design by experimenting with surface design techniques, let's take a quick look at a few fashion designers who have mastered the art of manipulation and are now well known for the incorporation of textile surface techniques into their designs. All of these designers have one thing in common: the use of a wide variety of techniques to make their designs look more interesting. Whether it is by creating a new textile, using lots of different fabrics and trims, or manipulating the fabric by painting, dyeing, or cutting it in interesting ways. These designs will intrigue all of your senses. This really turns the design into a work of wearable art. It is important to note that many designers just don't want to incorporate any surface design techniques, and that is totally okay. That just means that it is not your design style. But I do want to encourage you to at least try some of these techniques, because you never know whether it is something for you until you have tried it. You don't have to go overboard and eclectic. Surface design techniques can be subtle and understated too. Let's look at the different ways to create amazing effects. There are 3 basic ways of achieving fabric manipulation, and these are dyeing, sewing or stitching, and embellishment. Are you ready to learn some surface design techniques to make your designs come to life and stand out even more? We are going to start with dyeing first. Honestly, this is probably my favorite textile surface manipulation technique because the results are always surprising and inspiring, really guiding my design process and hopefully yours too. So let's start by looking at what exactly dyeing is. Textile dyeing is the process of transferring color onto a textile. This can be done in any stage of the manufacturing of the textile or garment process. The different dyeing stages are dyeing the fiber. So in this stage, this is where the fiber is dyed before it is turned into a yarn. Then you get dyeing the yarn stage, which is where the yarns that are spun from the fibers are dyed before the construction of the fabric. Fabrics where the yarn is dyed include tweed, plaid, or stripes. So where the yarn is woven into a pattern. And then we get the dyeing the fabric stage, and in this method, the fabric is dyed after it has been constructed. And then you get the dyeing the garment. This is where the finished garment is dyed to give it a specific color. Before we move on, let's quickly look at some dyeing terminology that will really help you understand the content better. Colorant. The colorant is any kind of material applied to your textile that imparts color to it. So this can be actual dye, dirt, fruit, anything that can impart color. We are going to look at some natural colorants in the lesson too, which is super exciting. And then you get dye. Now dye is a colorant that chemically bonds with the fibers of the textile. Score, so to score your fabric, just means that you are cleaning your fabric, preparing it for the dye process. The next funky word is mordant. Now a mordant is a fixative which enables the dye to adhere to the textile. Pigment, well, this is a colorant that adheres to the surface of the fibers. And then resist. This is a process by which areas of your textile are protected from the actions of the dye. This means that that protected area won't have any pigmentation. Because each fabric reacts differently to dye, it is beneficial to really understand the composition of the textile you want to dye and what type of textile will give you the best results. As a general rule, if a piece of fabric absorbs water really well, it will probably absorb the dye well too. Natural textiles like cotton, linen, hemp, bamboo, and silk are great absorbers, which means the dye will stick best on those. They also tend to be more color fast. Because most synthetic fibers are part plastic, they unfortunately don't take up the dye as easily, except for nylon. Now, nylon has a unique chemistry that lets it absorb dye easily. That's a fun fact. It is very easy to buy dye in the shops and just follow the instructions, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong. But I thought it would be fun to share something a little bit more experimental and creative with you, and that is natural dyeing. Why would you want to dye with fruits, vegetables, and plants, you ask? Well, you can get an incredible range of hues, from yellow, red to purple. It is a little bit of a mysterious process. You can predict the color, but because the plants vary from one to another, you never really know what you are going to get. The process of dyeing the textiles yourself is not just satisfying, but it is also more sustainable because these plant-based dyes are not as toxic as the commercial dyes. Please just be aware of the plants that you use. Don't use anything that is endangered. Although it is quite a time and labor-intensive process, it is so satisfying watching something change color right before your eyes. It also makes you respect the plants a bit more and appreciate their magic. We are going to explore the dyeing process right now, and this will consist out of 2 sections. What you need. This is your equipment and your dyeing materials, so your plants, spices or vegetables. Once you have all of your equipment, it is time to dye your fabric, and that takes me to the second section, which is the dyeing process. First, to dye a piece of fabric, you will need a piece of fabric, preferably undyed. Also, the more natural, the better. Then you need your natural material that you are going to dye with. You need your Mordant. Don't worry, I'm going to share some plant and Mordant tips with you after this slide. You will also need a large pot with a lid. You will also need a large plastic bucket or vat with a lid, a mesh strainer or sift, measuring cups or spoons, and a wooden spoon, and some gloves. Now these can be gardening gloves or household gloves. So how do you choose your dye materials? Well, you can just step into your garden or your neighbor's garden, with their permission of course, and begin experimenting with what you already have. Almost any plant will produce some color in the dye pot. Generally, the more material you have, the more concentrated your dye will be. Just a few tips before you start plant hunting. An important tip is to make sure that the plant is safe to handle, so rather stay away from plants like poison ivy. Please make sure to only pick plants indigenous to your area to keep the process as sustainable as possible. Usually once indigenous plants are established, they tend to grow well without a lot of maintenance. This way you also have a lot of material for dyeing, so it is really a win-win situation. The color of the dye may differ from the color of the plant. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you are picking a pink rose. That does not necessarily mean that the dye will be pink. So, talking about colors, let's quickly look at some plants, vegetables, and spices and the color dye they may create. Before we go through the colors, I just want to emphasize this again. It is important to remember that you may find that these plants, vegetables, or spices may not give the same color as predicted. That is all part of the magic of dyeing with natural materials, but these are really nice guidelines. First, we have orange. To get the color orange, you can dye with carrots, onion skins, and eucalyptus leaves. To get the color brown, you can dye with bark, coffee, tea, or pomegranate. That is an interesting one. To get the color pink, dye with berries, avocado, and this is not the flesh, this is only the skin and the pit of the avo. You can dye with hibiscus flowers, roses, and lavender. To get the color blue, dye with red cabbage, blueberries, and purple grapes. How interesting is the red cabbage? Once upon a time, dyes ruled the world. Okay, not literally, but it did play a big role in international trade and economics. But one dye stood out from the rest: indigo. In fact, indigo was so important, traders referred to it as blue gold because it was such a commodity. Indigo is one of the oldest dyes in the world, as early as 5,000 years ago. People used it to create a deep blue dye. It is a little bit darker than cobalt, but not quite navy. Indigo remains a very popular color today. You are probably wondering where it comes from. It is all in the name. Indigo means the Indian or from India, and it is produced from the Indigofera plant in India and China. Back to dyeing! Let's say you want to create a purple dye. You can use basil leaves, huckleberries, red onion skins, and hibiscus flowers. If you want to create a green dye, go for spinach, peppermint leaves, grass, and artichokes. If you want to create a yellow dye, go for bay leaves, paprika, turmeric, so now you can see the spices coming in a bit, celery leaves, lemon and orange peels, eucalyptus leaves, dandelion, and marigold flowers. And if you want to create a red dye, go for beets, pomegranates, and avocado. Again, the skin and the pit and not the flesh of the fruit. Let's quickly talk about Mordants. As you know by now, this fancy term means to soak the fabric in a fixative to help adhere the color to the textile. You can dye without using a mordant, but the color will definitely be stronger, more saturated, and last longer if you use it. It is also important to keep in mind that the type of mordant you use can also influence and change the color of the dye. I suggest you write down what you use to reference back to if needed. So let's quickly look at some types of mordant you will need. It is often a powdered metal such as alum, iron, or copper, but you can also use lemon juice, vinegar, cream of tartar, and baking soda. Let's quickly take a look at the most popular Mordant recipes, and these are alum. Stirring a few teaspoons of alum, which you can usually find in the spice aisle in the grocery store, into a cup of water. Once mixed, add this to boiling water. For fruit, simmer the fabric in a 1/4 cup salt and 4 cups water. And for vegetables, simmer fabric in 1 cup of vinegar and 4 cups of water. Let's look at the dyeing process. The overall process will be something along these lines. Score your fabric, create your dye, mordant your fabric, dye the fabric, and you can dip it once or a few times, rinse, and dry the fabric. Let's quickly go through all of these steps. So the first step is to score your fabric. Technically, natural textile should be scored with washing soda or soda ash, but if you don't have that, just wash your fabric so that it is clean and ready to be dyed. Step 2 is to create your dye. Gather your natural materials. Generally, the more you have, the better. Fill your pot with all of the natural materials, whether it be plants, vegetables, or spices, and add enough water to cover it. The less water you add, the more concentrated the dye will be, But you will also need enough water to be able to cover your piece of fabric, so also keep that in mind. Place the pot on the stove and turn the heat to high and cover the pot with a lid. Once the water boils, you can turn the heat down to a simmer. Let it simmer for at least an hour. If you can, the longer it simmers, the better. After about an hour, turn the heat off and let the plant material sit in the pot for several hours or even better overnight. Now is the time to strain your dye. You can do this by using a strainer or a sift over a bucket. Carefully pour the contents of the pot over the strainer. Store this dye until you are ready to use it. The nice thing about using natural materials is you can dispose of the plant material in your compost pile if you have one. Step 3 is to mordant your fabric. Fill a pot with water and boil, and then add your mordant of choice to the boiling water and stir until mixed. So if you are, let's say, using the salt recipe because you are dyeing with fruit, then mix your recipe and add it to the boiling water. If you are doing the vinegar recipe, mix your vinegar, mordant, and then add it to your boiling water. And then add the wet, scored fabric to the pot and stir it. After that, you can turn the heat down and simmer the fabric for at least an hour, stirring occasionally. During this stage, cover the pot with a lid. The fabric should simmer for at least an hour, but again, the longer the better. Again, after about an hour, you can turn off the heat and let the fabric cool down in the pot. Once cooled, rinse the fabric and immediately proceed to the dyeing of the fabric. Step 4 is the dyeing phase, and this is really where the magic happens. So first, you need to pour your dye back into the pot and slowly heat it. Add your wet fabric to the pot and remember to stir your fabric occasionally. Always dye with wet fabric, as this will give a more uniform appearance. Also, please make sure that the dye covers the piece of fabric. If it doesn't, just add a little bit more water. Boil the fabric for at least an hour using your wooden spoon to lift the corner of the fabric to check every now and then how and if it is absorbing the dye. When it comes to the boiling of fabric, I keep saying for at least an hour, but like the other, if you can do it for a bit longer, your results may be more successful. Turn off the heat and let the fabric cool down in the pot. You can stir it occasionally just to make sure the dye went into all the little folds. If you want to, you can always rinse the fabric and put it back into the pot, or put the cool down dye and fabric into a plastic tub and let it soak for another few hours. If you want, you can also add some vinegar or baking soda to the mix. It may change the color of your dye a little bit. So after the dyeing process, rinse your piece of fabric well with cold water, hang it up to dry, and then once it is dried, you may create anything you want with it. Please keep in mind that the colors may fade over time. And please also note that the process we have just been through will work for most natural materials, but this is just one method. These methods vary, so please feel free to do your own research too. There are many different dyeing techniques that produce amazing and diverse results, but we are going to go through some of these now, starting with tie-dye. I think we all know what tie-dyeing looks like, super funky, but do you know how to tie-dye? So, tie-dyeing is a method of dyeing by hand where colors and patterns are created by gathering or tying small sections of the fabric with string or elastic before it is immersed into dye. The sections where you have tied the string or elastic prevents the fabric to absorb the dye, and that is how those patterns are created. After you have dyed and dried the fabric, you can untie the string to reveal your circles, dots, and stripes. This is very exciting. Some popular tie-dye patterns include diagonal stripes or the sailor stripe design, and this you can do by folding the t-shirt into accordion-style pleats and wrapping it with rubber bands or string where you want the white lines to be. The ringer or bullseye design, and this you can do by pinching the fabric where you want the circle to be and lifting the shirt as you do it. Secure a rubber band below the pinch and continue adding rubber bands down your shirt, almost creating a tail. And then the spiral design, this is a very popular one. And this you do the same way as the bullseye, but once you have pinched and lifted your shirt, you twist the draped fabric to create the spiral. Tie rubber bands down the shirt to create multiple circles. Next up is ombre or dip dyeing, and this is also kind of a tie-dyeing technique. Ombre is a gradient fade of color encompassing many shades of a color, so a solid color that fades away with no harsh lines. To create this ombre effect, slowly dip the fabric into the dye. The secret to a good ombre is to go slow. This can take up to 20 minutes, so you will get a great fade and also a great arm workout. Obviously, the edge of the fabric will be darker because it has been submerged in the dye for the longest. Next up is a dyeing technique called Shibori. Now, Shibori is a Japanese resist dye technique like tie dyeing that dates back to the 8th century. The fabric is folded, twisted, or stitched in various ways so that the dye will only absorb or penetrate certain parts of the fabric, leaving behind beautiful and intricate patterns. There are a few methods, but many of them follow the same techniques as tie-dyeing. But you also get Shibori stitch resist, and this uses thread to create a pattern. Where you have placed the thread, those areas won't be penetrated by the dye. Synthetic thread is best to use because it does not take up the dye, making the stitches stand out even more. Let's quickly look at the steps to create a similar effect. First, you need to create your design by drawing it onto the fabric. This can be any pattern from something as simple as stripes to intricate flowers. Then you create your stitches by hand. Stitch along your sketch line. Important tip, don't let your stitches overlap. Instead, end your stitch and leave a little tail without tying a knot and continue with your design using a new piece of thread. You will use these loose ends or tails or whatever you want to call it of your thread in the next step. The next step is to gather your fabric after you have completed stitching your design. So pull the threads as tight as you can and gather the fabric along the stitch line. Once each line is tightly gathered, you can tie a knot at the end to ensure it stays that way. This can be quite time consuming, but it is totally worth it. Then, after you've gathered all of your stitch lines, you can dip your fabric into the dye, and after you've dipped it, carefully remove all of the stitches and admire your work. So as you can see from create the design to dye the fabric, it is quite a remarkable process and end result. And this is exactly why surface design techniques are so incredible, because you can create something out of nothing and really make it your own. The next dyeing technique is batik, and batik is an ancient traditional dyeing technique practiced in Southeast Asia, and it is a wonderful way to decorate a piece of fabric. With this method, a wax or a paste is used to cover certain parts of the fabric so that those areas do not absorb the dye. Traditionally, patterns are created using hot wax and removing the wax once dyed to reveal the pattern, but there are also other ways you can achieve this look. I'm going to share 3 popular ways with you now. So first up is batik with salt. With this method, you have to dye your fabric first. When you are taking it out of the dye vat, spread the fabric over a drying rack and sprinkle salt on it. You can be as generous as you want, and it can be totally randomly sprinkled, or you can create some kind of pattern. The salt will absorb some of the dye and produce a nice and quite natural looking pattern. Let the fabric dry with the salt on and rinse after it has dried completely. The next 2 methods use a flour and water mixture or paste, and this is super easy to make. Just use a ratio of 1:1, that is 1 cup of flour to 1 cup of water. Your mixture should be thin but not too runny. Open your piece of fabric so that it is flat and spread a thin layer of the paste all over your fabric. As it dries, you will notice the fabric distorting a little bit, cracking here and there. Don't worry, we want those tiny cracks. When completely dry, either dip your fabric into the dye or paint the dye onto the fabric. Allow it to dry. The easiest way to remove the paste is to pop your fabric into hot water until the paste is soft and easy to remove. You will notice a cool cracking effect on your fabric like we see in the image. The last method also uses this paste, but instead of covering the whole piece of fabric, you can use a piping bag or a paintbrush and draw a picture or pattern with the paste. Once the paste is dry, you can again dip your fabric or you can paint the dye onto the fabric. And when the dye is dry, you can pick off the pieces of paste and this will reveal your pattern underneath. An important tip for both paste methods, try and keep the fabric as tight as possible when you are applying the paste and when the paste is drying for the best result. These are just a few very cool dyeing techniques. There are many more like screen printing, discharge print or creating stencils and using it to create patterns on your fabric. Whether you are creating natural dyes or experimenting with different dye techniques, they all have one thing in common: the willingness to experiment. Experimentation is key for anyone who wants to learn and grow, especially as a fashion designer. But just some tips before you start dyeing. Keep your dyeing equipment and your food pots separate, please, guys. And also remember to wear gloves when you dye to avoid staining your hands. And choose an environment that offers good ventilation when dyeing. Do you dream about creating your own fashion collection? A few pieces that screams who you are as a designer. In the next lesson, we discuss all the steps that will allow you to make your dreams come to life. It really is such an exciting lesson, and I remember when I was starting out as a fashion designer, I just wanted to draw and create collections, and these steps really helped me and other fashion designers to really make these dreams come to life. So I really hope to see you there. Sewing is not just for hemming garments and sewing seams. Sewing allows you to create incredible fabric manipulation techniques to create beautiful patterns and textures on your fabric. We are going to jump straight in and start with applique. Applique is a beautiful technique where you sew pieces of fabric onto another piece of fabric, creating a layered design. This you can do by hand or with a sewing machine. The fabric pieces are stitched onto the background fabric with a variety of different stitches like the buttonhole stitch, the zigzag and satin stitch. You also get reverse applique, which is when you cut a shape out of your fabric and place another fabric underneath so that the fabric underneath is revealed. You can really go wild and add multiple layers to create interesting patterns and dimensions. The image on your screen right now is a nice example of applique. Here are some nice applique tips. Make sure that the different types of fabric you are using are compatible. This means that if you have a lightweight fabric, don't applique a heavy fabric onto it because it will distort the fabric and the pattern. When sourcing your thread, you can use normal cotton thread, any color you want. It is important to add interfacing to the back of the fabric to make it more stable during the stitching phase. The types of interfacing can vary. You get iron-on, sticky ones, cutaway or mesh stabilizers, and tearaway stabilizers. The tearaway one is my favorite because once your work is done, you can literally just tear it away. Adding a stabilizer makes a big difference in the quality and look of the applique, so please don't skip this step. Before we move on to the next slide, the image on screen is a very good example of reverse applique. And then we move on to cut work. Cut work is also a technique you can do by hand or by machine, and this technique involves the embroidery of a pattern and then cutting sections out in between, almost giving it a lace effect. Again, please use a stabilizer before you start sewing your pattern on your fabric. This will also help to keep the fabric intact after you have cut out your shapes. You can use the zigzag stitch, the buttonhole stitch, or hand stitches to create your embroidery. Another way to add texture and interest to your garment or your piece of fabric is by adding trims to it. Fabric trims are accents that add an extra little something special to your garment or your project. Trims can really turn something ordinary into something extraordinary. Some trims that can give your garment the wow factor include lace trims or edging, braids, piping, fringe, beaded or embroidered tape, cords, ribbons, and my favorite, tassels. Just a few tips for sewing trims. Just like your fabric, you should always pre-wash your trims before sewing them onto a garment. This will get rid of any dye left on the trim and also avoid shrinkage. Since most trims are pretty delicate, use a pressing cloth when ironing and pressing your garment to keep the face of the trim undamaged. Again, most of these trims are super delicate, so instead of pinning it in place when sewing, use something like sticky tape or bobby pins to avoid holes in the trims. And now it is time to look at some embellishment techniques, starting with sequins. Any kind of embellishment like beads or sequins can add a lot of texture to your fabric. So let's talk a little bit about sequins first. You can glue sequins onto fabric, but it is advisable to sew it on by hand using a beading needle for a better finish and quality. The thread used to sew the sequins onto the garment should match the color of the actual sequins. You can also try sewing with invisible thread. Make sure that they all lie in the same direction. Next up is beading, which is the ultimate form of fabric embellishment. Beading means the stitching of beads onto a piece of fabric, creating beautiful shapes, patterns, textures, and dimension. Next up is embroidery. Now, embroidery machines or sewing machines that can do embroidery are usually super expensive. So instead of focusing on machine embroidery, we are going to look at hand embroidery. So, embroidery is a technique of decorating a piece of fabric with beautiful stitches using embroidery thread or ribbons. In order to create amazing hand embroidery pieces, you will need the following: embroidery thread, ribbons, hand embroidery needles, scissors. We are not done yet. You will also need an embroidery hoop, a thimble to protect your finger when pushing the needle through, and marking tools to draw out your design. I am quickly going to show you some basic stitches you can start with. So here you can see quite a few stitches, and I'm going to point out the most basic and important and most popular ones to you. So first we have the running stitch. The running stitch is a simple stitch used to create a dashed line, and it is great for outlines and adding detail. You can really play with the length of the stitch and the spaces in between. They can be even or irregular. The back stitch is one of the most versatile stitches. It is great to create outlines and also looks great with other stitches, which is quite important when you are creating a whole work of art. Then you get the Fringe Knot, which is a little bit challenging, but it is a great stitch to use when you want to create a bit of texture. This stitch involves wrapping the needle with thread to create a knot on the surface of the textile. Next up is the chain stitch. Now this stitch you use to create a bolder line, as you can see. The reason this stitch stands out a bit more is because this stitch forms a row of linked stitches. It's quite beautiful. The fly stitch is next, and it kind of forms a V shape, and you can use it to create all kinds of effects. And then you get the couching stitch. Unlike the other stitches, this one uses two lengths of thread, one remaining on the surface and the other one tacking it in place. This is a great way to fill an area, but also a great stitch to create an outline and also to create texture. Last but not least is the blanket stitch, and this is a pretty recognizable stitch used to create borders for applique designs or to create interesting patterns. Again, you can play with the stitch length and the spacing. There are, as you can see, many other stitches that I have not even mentioned, like the stem stitch, and it is left that orange curvy line in the image, which is also great for outlines, the feather stitch and the split stitch, but this does not mean that they are not great. I only prioritize the most used ones today. Now, the basic stitches are great to create outlines, but sometimes you want to fill in an area, and to do so you need more stitches. So let's quickly look at some filling stitches. So this is a great image showing you what the different stitches will look like. As you can see, there are quite a few, but I'm just going to highlight the most popular filling stitches, starting with the humble satin stitch. This is one of the most classic stitches, great for filling smaller areas. The thread is a simple loose stitch set side by side, which means the bigger the area that needs to be filled, the weaker the stitch will become. Next up is a stitch from the previous slide, the coaching stitch. The great thing about this stitch is that it can be shaped to fill basically any shape. Remember, this stitch uses 2 lengths of thread, and the cool thing about that is that you can experiment with 2 different colors. Then we have the Fringe Knot again, and it is also a fun filling stitch that add a lot of dimension to your design. You can play with the size of the knot and how far apart they are from each other. In this image, as you can see, they are super duper close together. And then you get the seed stitch, which is also sometimes referred to as the rice stitch, but really it is just a set of random stitches used to fill an area. You can have them super close together or quite spread out like we see in the image. And then you get the long and short stitch, and this can be used for any area no matter how big or small. All of the stitches we have just gone through can be created using ribbon too, although it must be a ribbon that can fit through the eye of your needle. The ribbon will give a bit more texture to your design. Fabric manipulation or surface textile design is quite a personal but a very rewarding journey. You can give life to a worn or old piece of clothing by really embracing the art of mending, or you can create a one-of-a-kind textile to make your brand new and exclusive design from. With a pinch of creativity, you can transform any piece of fabric into a unique work of art. Today's lesson is probably one of my favorite lessons so far. I want you to take a piece of fabric, either one you have lying around or a bought one, and dye it using whatever you can find inside or around your house, and using any dyeing techniques discussed today. Remember, natural fibers absorb the dye better, so when you are sourcing your fabric, go for cotton, linen, hemp, or even silk. When you share your challenge on your favorite social media platform, please include the composition of your fabric. So whether it is cotton, 100% cotton, or 80% cotton, 20% polyester, whatever the composition, please share that with us. Your dye material, and this can be a plant source, a vegetable, spices, or it can be a store-bought dye, and your dyeing techniques. So whether it was tie-dyeing, shibori, just a normal dye, ombre, whatever it was, please tell me what you have done. I would love to see your amazing dyed pieces of fabric, so please tag Shore Academy and use the hashtag #ShoreFashionTextiles. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this challenge, and I'm really excited to see what you are going to create. Guys, before you run off and start dyeing your amazing pieces of fabric, I just want to take a minute and really show you how far you have come since you've started this course. Well done on completing another lesson, designers. You guys are doing so well. I can't wait to see you next time for lesson 4, creating a collection. Do you guys remember our lesson quote? When a garment triggers all of your senses, then it is a full experience. When designing, where do you place your emphasis? What is the most important part of your design? How do you plan on making your design, whether it is minimalistic or eclectic, stand out from the rest? How do you plan on triggering the senses of your viewer? Until next time, stay fashionable, designers.